Good afternoon. Let me start the session. Welcome to the panel discussions on public-private partnerships. I would like to invite our moderator, Mr. Yescom. Mr. Yescom is the director of YCR Consulting Limited, and he has a wide range of experience in public-private partnership and project finance in infrastructure, and as a financier and also as an advisor to several government agencies, both in developing and developed countries. And I'm very pleased to have him as a moderator to this session, which will focus on PPP in green infrastructure. Please welcome Mr. Escom and distinguished speaker with a big round of applause.
Thank you. Can everyone hear? Is it okay? No. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this panel session on public-private cooperation. We're fortunate today to have a panel of very experienced and knowledgeable speakers. The detailed bios are in your program book or on the website, so I won't repeat these. And I'll introduce the speakers starting from your left. Mr. Cholhan Han Jong, who is Managing Director at BNP Paribas Seoul, heading the Export Finance Korea team in the Structured Finance Group. Attorney Sherry Austria, who is Deputy Executive Director of the Public-Private Partnership Center of the Philippines. Ms. Austria is taking the place of her Executive Director, who has been unable to join us. Ms. Hye-Hong Yang, Deputy Director of the Economic Cooperation Development Fund Planning Department in the Export-Import Bank of Korea, or KEXIM. As to our final panelist, unfortunately, Mr. Binyam Rea of the World Bank has been taken ill, and so has been unable to travel to join us. But I'm very grateful to Professor John Matthews, Chair of Strategy at the Macquarie Graduate School of Management, who's kindly agreed to join us in his place. So the structure of this session is that I'll ask each participant to make some brief remarks, then we'll throw open the discussion to questions or comments within the panel and from the floor. I hope we'll have a good amount of time for discussion with the floor. Then at the end of the session, I'll ask each panelist to provide some brief recommendations on the subject of our discussion. So as you might guess from the backgrounds of our speakers, our main area for discussion will be major infrastructure projects, especially public-private partnerships, and also the role of export finance and overseas development aid in financing such projects. Public-private partnerships, or PPPs, is one of these terms that means different things to different people. So I think I should explain what it means in the context of the discussion that we're having. We're talking about public-private partnerships for infrastructure, or PPPI, whereby the private sector designs, builds, finances, and operates public infrastructure under a long-term contract with the public sector. And at the end of that contract, the infrastructure reverts to the ownership and control of the public sector. So we're talking about public projects, privately financed. Examples of this type of project would be a toll road concession, or social infrastructure projects such as building a hospital. And of course the Republic of Korea has been a pioneer and still is a major player in this field. So in this context, green growth has to balance the opposing priorities of achieving economic growth and social development without putting the environment, including our climate, at risk. In other words, sustainable growth. The aim has to be to achieve both economic and environmental gains by reducing inefficiencies in the management of resources and the stimulation of new sources of activity through innovation and green growth. So the key questions which have been laid out for this session are, firstly, what are the major challenges and issues in identifying green growth projects, originating them, and getting them to the stage where a feasibility study can be carried out? What will be the roles of the public and the private sector in overcoming these challenges and developing more bankable projects in developing countries? Secondly, what makes private sector investment or PPPs in green infrastructure different from those in traditional infrastructure? What are the key risks and challenges in mobilizing and scaling private investment in green infrastructure? How can these barriers for private sector investment be adequately addressed by the public sector to make progress? Thirdly, for less developed countries where the private sector is still in its infancy, what is an effective way to promote private sector and market development in line with the green growth pathway? And fourthly and finally, what are the unique roles of global institutions like GGGI in facilitating private sector investment and PPPs in green infrastructure, from policy and institution design to project preparation and implementation, particularly in developing countries? How can these organizations effectively contribute to designing and deploying global financial and non-financial mechanisms for green growth and infrastructure projects? How can they assist governments in developing and greening project pipelines? So with this very brief background in mind, I'd like to begin the discussion with Mr. Zhang, since we obviously have to deal first with the private sector here, I think, which is where the money is coming from. So I understand your particular expertise is in the power generation sector, which of course is especially crucial in the context of our discussion. So perhaps you can give us a private sector viewpoint on the key risks and challenges in mobilizing and scaling private investment in major projects, while at the same time ensuring that this investment is sustainable. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Edward. Well, I'm very happy to attend this panel discussion, and actually, today I'm putting on the green tie, and our corporate BNP Paribas corporate color is also green. Yeah? So I'm very much familiar with this green idea, but in terms of my business and responsibility, I'm responsible for providing advisory service and also financing solutions to the Korean clients who are doing a business in overseas. So far, I have been involved in quite many types of overseas projects, but from the commercial bankers' point of view, we have been focusing more on the solid structured transaction, solid structured project, which is power plant project. Yeah. And in terms of challenges and some barriers, well, of course, as some of you are aware and agree, lots of commercial bankers have been suffering some difficulties in terms of the liquidity since the financial crisis and followed by Euro crisis. Many European banks are facing some difficulty in the liquidity, but liquidity issue is now, I think, quite overcome. And generally speaking, the current business environment is not really favorable, particularly for commercial bankers. I mean, project financiers and so on. For instance, there are lots of measures and guidelines to comply with, and also lots of some technical and, for instance, CSR. Corporate social responsibilities. For instance, equator principles. Lots of bankers should comply with, has been revised very recently. In accordance with this new guideline, the restriction is more heavier than before. For instance, we also apply internally very tight guideline, particularly to coal-fired power plants. For instance, this is not our own bank policy, but I'm pretty sure that the lots of global IBs have same guideline, but for new coal-fired power plant project, minimum net energy efficiency should be 38%. Yeah, 38%. It is very difficult for project sponsors to comply with. 38 means it is only possible when the supercritical technology is used. So, but in Vietnam or in some emerging countries, it is not easy for them to comply with this key parameter. So, if this guideline is not met, then bankers cannot provide financing, even advisory service. It is very, very crucial. So this is a new challenge and change. Yeah. So actually, I have several experiences to decline projects brought by our clients simply for this guideline. So in order to avoid this problem, and I'm pretty sure that this is the main trend. So everybody should know this trend will continue. So our clients should be well knowledgeable about this trend and new guideline. Some tricky thing is in order to increase this net energy efficiency by, let's say, 2%. Usually, the project brought by our clients has the net energy efficiency of 36%. So there is some small gap, just 2%. But in order to improve 2%, then project cost is 20% higher than the original project cost. So it is very, very, very difficult. But anyway, again, this is very new trend or a new direction. So all the clients should be well aware of this trend.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think it's worth just maybe explaining for those of you who are not aware of what are known as the Equator Principles. The Equator Principles is a set of voluntary guidelines adopted by most major banks, I think, around the world now.
Now we are 79.
79,
yeah,
is that
79.
right? Okay.
Financial institutions. Yeah.
These are guidelines that relate basically to sustainability of projects in environmental terms. And I think you can see from what Mr. Jong is saying that these are actually really changing bank behavior. The banks are actually declining projects on sustainability grounds, which if you go back, I don't know, 10 years, I think it would have been far less likely. So this is, I think, a really serious effort by the private sector banking industry financing major projects to do so in a sustainable way. And I think that's a very important development. And again, as Mr. Jong says, I think it's a development that is going to continue to affect bank behavior. Okay, so thank you. So maybe I can then pass to Ms. Austria to ask you for a government perspective on major challenges and issues in identifying and originating green infrastructure projects, and also to ask you how governments can adapt barriers to private sector investment and what role you think donor agencies and global institutions can play in this respect.
Okay, thank you for the question, and good afternoon, everyone. So coming from the government or working under the government, I can share with you the Philippine experience as we start or launch our PPP program in 2010. The major constraint that we encountered during that period is the lack of the capacity of the implementing government agencies to select, prioritize, and implement PPP projects. This situation then translates into a lack of pipeline consisting of bankable and commercially viable PPP projects. So in 2011, the Philippine government forged a partnership with some international donors through a capacity development technical assistance agreement. These international donors are the foreign governments of Canada and Australia, and administer the CDTA, or Capacity Development Technical Assistance, is being administered by the Asian Development Bank. Now, this CDTA has two components. The first one is a capacity building component, wherein it aims to build the capacity and strengthen the institutional capability of key implementing agencies in doing PPPs, such as the PPP Center, the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Planning, and selected line ministries. And then the second component is the PDMF component, or the Project Development and Monitoring Facility. The Australian government gave a grant or co-financing to the PDMF fund, plus a counterpart funding from the Philippine government. So as envisioned by the capacity building component, we were able to generate the following outputs. We were able to strengthen our PPP legal and regulatory frameworks. we were able to capacitate our key government agencies who are undertaking PPPs. We have institutionalized best practices in the PPP process, and we were able to establish a long-term financing and risk management mechanisms. On the other hand, the PDMF component was able to come up or generate a robust pipeline of PPP projects. To explain very briefly the concept of PDMF, it is a revolving pool of funds which affords our implementing agencies with technical assistance in doing the feasibility studies of their projects and transaction advisory support services during the bidding stage of these projects. Right now we have 22 internationally renowned consultancy of firms coming from different areas of the world like United States, United Kingdom, Japan, India, China, Germany, Spain, and Singapore, Germany, and with local counterparts from the Philippines. Our projects benefited from the international expertise and experience of this PDMF consortia of firms. The PDMF had an initial funding of $7 million put in by the Philippine government, plus $6 million coming from the Australian government through the ADB-administered CDTA. Because of the value added and good track of our PDMF, funds were later on added, thus making the total fund of the PDMF to $76 million. To date, our PDMF was able to provide funding support to 39 PPP projects out of the 57 projects in our pipeline. Basically, it represents 68% of our pipeline. We have also, as I've mentioned, we have expanded and reconstituted our panel of firms. We started from 9 in 2011, then upgraded to 11 consortia of firms in 2012, and now we have 22. Our PDMF has likewise supported infrastructure projects with green technology and adaptation to climate change. To name a few, we have a toll road project with a dike component, which aims not only to reduce traffic congestion, but as well mitigate the flood control that within the coastal communities along the largest lake in the Philippines, which is the Laguna de Bay or Laguna Lake. We also have a motor vehicle inspection system project, which aims to institutionalize the emission testing centers in partnership with the private sector, wherein those vehicles which will not pass the air pollution test will have to pay a penalty or fine. Then we also have a natural gas pipeline project with clean energy fueling major power plants in the country and industrial zones and factories in some of our provinces and cities. We also have a ferry system development project wherein it will divert passengers using cars and buses to a more efficient mode of transportation using the city waterways. And of course, we have several mass transit projects which will reduce the volume of vehicular traffic and reduce the air pollution.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think this question of capacity building, which everyone talks about, it's interesting to see how you're implementing it. Although the thing I would also say about capacity building is that one also actually needs to maintain capacity. My experience, even in the UK, is that these PPP projects are, from a structural, technical, legal point of view, extremely complex. And it's all very well to maintain the capacity to build up the project pipeline and assign them, but then you need to maintain this capacity to continue to manage them. And I can tell you that in the UK, in some areas, we're failing miserably as far as this is concerned. I mean, this is what I spend some of my time on, and I go and see local governments who have PPP projects, and I say to them now, where is the financial model? Oh, I'm not sure where that is. So, it's really quite surprising how bad management of these projects can be. And the result is, of course, if they're not well managed, then the benefits start for the projects start being lost. But I wonder also, do you think that there is, do you think that PPPs in particular actually do, because of their structure, actually have actually make it easier in some ways to introduce sustainability, because in the PPP you can set performance standards.
Yes.
So as opposed to to just letting out some other kind of contract, you can set performance standards, and therefore you can actually introduce sustainability as a performance standard, which I think from what you've been saying,
Yes,
you've been partly doing.
In all our PPP contracts, we have set the key performance indicators that the concessionaire needs to comply over the duration of the contract. In case they will be able to, in case of failure to comply with these KPIs, they can be punished or penalized through liquidated damages. We have also set the minimum performance standards and specifications as they build our facility. So they have to comply at the very minimum to our conceptual designs and minimum standards. Let me share as well, we have recognized that problem, retaining the institutional capacity. We are not only training our people, but we are training the agency as well. And how do we do that? As a government, it's very hard for us to offer a better compensation package.
Exactly.
In case
That's one
of
of the big
private
problems,
sector,
yes. Yeah.
sometimes our consultants from PDMF would tap our own people and entice them by offering a better compensation package, which would be very difficult for the government like the Philippines to offer a counterpart compensation package. So what we have done is that every time we send our people to trainings, either locally or abroad, we require them to do a report so that it will be left to the agency. We require them to do a brown bag sessions so that all those left in the agency, together with the implementing agencies or line ministries, will also be capacitated. And every time we invite speakers and resource persons or trainers, we will ask their consent if we can videotape or record the training. So it will be left in our library. We have also developed training manuals. We have one for PPP manual for national government agencies and PPP manual for our local government units. Yeah, basically that's it.
Yeah, I think that's another interesting point you made there, because we have exactly the same problem in the UK, that basically you can't retain staff in the public sector because they will be paid more in the private sector. So I mean, all one can do is accept it as you are and make the best of it, in effect, to try and get good value out of the people while they're there, and ensure that you keep bringing people up. Who are going to replace the people who are leaving. It is inevitable that people will leave, I think. Yeah. Okay, thank you. So now, if I may turn to Ms. Yang, I understand that KXM aims to support PPP project financing in developing countries by providing blended finance, in other words, both to the host government and to the concessionaire, joining its export finance with EDCF development assistance and concessional loans. So I think you're well placed to comment on how these different public sector sources can be leveraged along with the private sector to promote green infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. And as Mr. Escombe mentioned, KXM aims to support PPP project financing in developing countries by providing two different financial sources. KXM, as a Korean export credit agency, is providing comprehensive export credit and guarantee programs to support Korean enterprises in conducting overseas business, including investment in PPP project. The bank is also responsible for the operation of the EDCF, which is Economic Development Cooperation Fund, that is also a Korean Official Development Assistance Program. So I can say KXM has two official financing arms to support PPP project financing, but today I'd like to more focus on the role of EDCF development assistance, because official development assistance has more powerful impact on developing countries, particularly on least developed countries, I think. So regarding green infrastructure investment, the major role of public finance is, I think, to catalyze the private sector investment by addressing risk faced by private sector investors. I'd like to briefly discuss these types of risk, like project risk, financing risk, and country risk, and the mechanism of public finance based on the case example. So private sector investors face different kinds of risk when initiating or implementing the PPP project. In general, at the project level, revenue volatility, resource risk, or technology risk could be critical to private investors. Well, let's suppose that we are planning to build a hydroelectric power generation plant in Laos. Private investors are definitely expecting to cover the full cost of the project, including the cost of capital, and achieve the return commensurate with the risk associated with this Laos project. If the project does not guarantee the positive debt service coverage ratio, then the investors will reconsider the investment decision. And second, the financing risk, such as debt availability, adequate debt tenors, or reasonable debt terms, are another significant barriers to investment. So let's say the Laos project has the commercial viability, but what if the financial resource is insufficient to cover the cost of project? The private investors may put off making its investment decision. And if the project aims to achieve the environmental gain as well, the project risk may escalate because of higher technology risk and higher capital intensity. The Laos project might require resettlement plan for local people and safeguard to preserve rare species. This issue may require alternatives such that diverts watercourse or takes alternative technology. Of course, it will raise the total cost of the project and financing risk as well, which can be a barrier to the investment too. Country risk, such as regulatory risk, foreign exchange, or sovereign risk, is common risk factor in overseas business. Many of these risks, however, could be addressed by public sector finance. Concessional debt are typically provided to address issues of liquidity, tenor, and cost of funds. Concessionality can be linked to the achievement of the desired result through interest rate reduction, longer tenors, or with different rank and security packages. In case of the Laos project, EDCF may provide a concessional loan to Laos government, who is also a stakeholder of the project. Or it may support building the transmission line to deliver the power generated from this plant. The private investors may increase the revenue by reducing the O&M cost. And last, I think the soft loan provided by official development assistance can address financing risk too. Country risk might be mitigated by provision of political risk guarantees. The coverage is typically enable the commercial finance to enter into the developing countries where sovereign risk is generally high, so the sustainability of the project is uncertain. For the Laos project, if the sovereign risk, such as nationalization and appropriation, is the main barrier to investment, and if it is covered by EDCF guarantees, the private finance may be easily mobilized. Technical assistance or project preparation support is another instrument required rather than or in addition to outright finance. Technical assistance might be required to help build the right enabling environment for PPP project, or to build capacity of local personnel to devise, manage, and monitor PPP-related policy frameworks, as Ms. Sherry said. Yeah. At the project level, technical assistance may be a very effective use of donor resource to create awareness of green infrastructure investment opportunities, whose main barriers lie with sponsors' lack of awareness, experience, or relevant skill sets. Project preparation support also addresses the project risk, such as technology risk or unstable revenue expectation. EDCF may support the preparation of the feasibility study to address issues on these project risks. These various sources of finance come into play at the different stages of investment activities and can leverage significant financing from other sources. However, such multiples in leverage effect may be higher in areas where policy support from the host government is strong and reliable, and credible government with the capacity to implementing the project is another factor to increase the leverage effect. I mentioned the Laos project, and actually it will be the first PPP project that KEXIM provides with both export financing and concessional loan. KEXIM, actually along with EDCF, has continued to facilitate the PPP project by providing mixed finance, but we haven't accomplished much yet. There might be lots of challenges and reasons to explain this, but I think on top of these challenges, the lack of policy and capacity of the government in coordinating the project are typical barriers in PPP projects in developing countries. Well, given that available financial sources are expected to continue to fall far short of development needs, mobilizing private sources are critical in achieving development goal from the public sector point of view. And in order to attract the diverse resource, the public finance should continue to play a catalytic role, particularly in the least developed countries, where the basic infrastructure to facilitate PPP is insufficient and weak. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think you were right to emphasize earlier on this question of technology. I mean, I think it has to be understood that when one's talking about the banking component of financing projects, or indeed other debt sources, there's the well-known saying, which I think is supposed to be by Mark Twain, that a banker is a man who lends you an umbrella when it's not raining. In other words, actually banks are not in business to take risk. They can't afford to take risk, because if a bank is lending on a project, it's earning a small margin over its own cost of funds. And if one project out of a portfolio goes bad, you end up with a loss. So you have to be extremely conservative as a bank, and it's no use complaining about banks being conservative. That's just inevitable as part of their business. So I wonder, what do you think? You mentioned this question of challenges in implementing, bringing public finance into this kind of thing. What do you think are some of the challenges involved?
Well, I think actually, like in case of PPPs, the private sector actually initiate the project and implement the project, so they are the kind of key players of the PPP project, not the public sector, I think. So, but public sector usually, the counterpart of the public finance is host government. So I think we have twofold challenges. So for the for the private sector, in order to meet the private sector's requirement, I think also the official development assistance should equip the various kinds of financing instruments. But maybe this might be limited to only Korean case, but I think ODA in Korea has not developed, we has not developed more various financing instruments like other MDBs, and then so it is very challenging to meet different kinds of requirements from the private sector. And the other challenge is from the government side. And as I mentioned before, we are talking with the host government, and it is very difficult to push the host government forward to the the business-friendly policy, because we do not have the kind of leverage effect to push. So, as Ms. Austria mentioned, the capacity building and the awareness of the government is very important, and I think that's the biggest challenge for our public sector.
Okay, thank you. So finally, if I may ask Professor Matthews to give us his views on challenges facing green infrastructure finance, which I think you're going to talk about.
Yes. Okay, thank you. Well, maybe I can take my my beginnings from Ms. Yang's comments that there's a role, as you were saying, for both the private sources of finance and the public sources of finance. And the energy level in this room is a little bit low at the moment, so maybe I'll raise it a bit by taking a bit of a polemical approach to this. We had this discussion in the morning session on the public and the private and the respective roles that they play. And I think it's fair to say, and this is where I'll be maybe a little bit controversial, I think it's fair to say that in United Nations circles, around the Kyoto process, climate change, and all of these debates, there's been a very strong emphasis on the exclusive character of the public sector, the public finance, tax-based finance. And you can hear debates in UN circles about what to do about climate change, and you'll never hear the role of the private sector. It's always public sector. And I think that works against the possibilities for really making a difference in some of these climate change issues. And so it was heartening that at the end of the session this morning, there was a sense that financing from the private sector is becoming a mainstream option. And that's certainly my starting point, and the book that I'm publishing this month on the greening of capitalism, it's starting from this premise that finance has to be a mainstream feature of dealing with climate change. And another remark that she made was that if the conditions are right, then private financing is relatively easy to find. Yeah. Don't know whether I'm paraphrasing you there, but that's the issue. I mean, how can it be structured in such a way that it is easy to find? And that's really what I'd like to spend most of my time talking about, because really what we're talking about here is scale. So the discussions around technology have understood that it's the scaling up of technologies to a vast scale is really the issue. And likewise in the case of finance. So if we take this case of the US-China climate agreement of last week that I mentioned in the plenary session this morning. Very, very important agreement because it commits China commits itself to raising the proportion of its renewable energies from 10% of all energy sources currently to 20% by 2030. Now that might not sound on the face of it all that amazing, but that means in effect that China will be building green infrastructure in the form of renewable energy systems of about 1,000 gigawatts between now and 2030. That's 1,000 billion watt power sources. So looking at the number of weeks in a year, that would be about 1.3 gigawatt power station every single week for every year in the next 15 years. Now I don't think there's been ever, apart from going back to the pyramids in ancient Egypt, I don't think there's ever been a larger green infrastructure project than that which has just been announced by China. So where is the finance going to come from? You have to talk about serious scale of finance. And if we take a benchmark figure, which I've been informed by my confidence in the finance sector that around $6 per watt is a good investment figure for this kind of infrastructure. And so we're talking about $6,000 billion over 15 years. That is $6 trillion over 15 years. So about $200 billion per year. Now, if that's just China, then of course India, Brazil and these other countries will want to be matching it because they will be benefiting from the cost reductions that China is driving through this huge infrastructure push. So these levels of investment are truly enormous. Now, China has institutions like the China Development Bank, which is a very important development bank, and that can play a significant role in channeling the needed levels of finance to the Chinese renewable energy sector. And there have been similar kinds of calls for very, very large levels of infrastructure investment from, say, the International Energy Agency with their new report, the World Energy Investment Outlook, calling for very, very large levels of investment. But a lot of that is going to fossil fuel-based investment, whereas the Bloomberg New Energy Finance people in London are talking about the levels of investment just going to the renewable sector of around $250 billion per year. Now, at this scale, where are those sources of funding, of finance, going to come from? And that's where a lot of discussions end up. They say, well, we need something bigger. And then they'll say, well, what about another kind of green climate finance corporation with more tax-based funding? But we're talking about transforming the capitalist system. That's really what climate change is all about. And so we need to take a realistic view of what are the sources of funding in the capitalist system. Now, here we have a chart produced by McKinsey's, a very important chart because it shows you just what is the scale of this system that we call capitalism. It's basically a financial system. It's a system for raising finance and channeling finance towards productive investments. And if you look along that right column, you'll see that equity funds total about $50 trillion, whereas bond finance raised through the bond markets is around $100 trillion. Now, I haven't been to a single discussion on climate change sponsored by the United Nations where I've heard that there are $100 trillion under management in the bond markets, and that those are funds that are largely invested at the moment in the fossil fuel sector, in business as usual, and they have to be redirected in some way to the green sector and the renewable energy sector in particular. So that would be my starting point for a discussion about public and private roles in the greening of finance and the transformation of our industrial system from one based on fossil fuels, which have been wonderfully productive. They've worked extremely well for the West. That's why the West is wealthy, because of the power of fossil fuels. But we know now that they can't go on forever. We know now that there are real problems involved if China and then India and then Brazil and then the Philippines and then other countries continue to use fossil fuels in the way that in the West they were used with abandon. So clearly something different has to be done, and therefore we need to find a way that finance can be structured so that it becomes possible for serious investors to channel their funds towards the green sector. And these are the serious investors, the institutional investors, the people who manage the pension funds, the insurance funds, the sovereign wealth funds, even the hedge funds that were mentioned this morning as well. And according to the latest data from the OECD, there is over $70 trillion under management by these institutional investors. And that should be, in my view, where the discussion about climate change really has to start. How can the financial instruments be fashioned so that they become attractive? And as Ben was saying earlier this morning, that it becomes legal for the pension funds and the superannuation funds to invest in these kinds of instruments that will channel funds towards the green projects. So the way that they can do that is to develop instruments, financial instruments that are floated on both the equity markets and the bond markets, which are directing their activities towards greening the economy. And I had a couple of other slides, but I'll have to just speak to this one. But basically, we look at the greening of the finance sector when we talk about green bonds or climate bonds. And interestingly enough, after the waters have been tested by the multilaterals, the World Bank, the European Investment Bank, some of the development banks like the Asia Development Bank or the African Development Bank, we find that Korea Export-Import Bank has been one of the first in the world to issue a national level, a national green bond, issued in February last year to the tune of $500 million, floated on the bond markets around the world, in New York, in Tokyo, in Frankfurt, and bond investors in all of those parts of the world were keen to take up that bond, so it was oversubscribed. It was channeled towards to projects that involved Korean companies working on green projects around the world, not in Korea, but around the world. And it was sweetened by the Korean Export-Import Bank undertaking that the returns would be paid out of consolidated revenue rather than just the individual projects. That's a sweetener because the investors are not yet completely familiar with these instruments. But I've mentioned that because there's Korea taking a strong leap forward. Seoul as a financial centre, perhaps taking a step beyond Frankfurt or Tokyo or Paris or London. And I think this shows that there is real interest on the part of institutional investors in these kinds of financial instruments. And we really have to get away from this endless kinds of sniping, I think, between the public and the private, and see the private sector as ultimately the source of the funds that will transform the global industrial system that we call capitalism, and transform it in a way that will make it sustainable and safe for all of us.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, I just pick up this question of pension fund and the comment that was made this morning for those of you who were in that session that well, we need to change the law so that pension funds can make these investments. Well, speaking as one of the older people in this room, I'm not sure I want my pension fund to do anything except make sure I get a pension. And the way it does that is by investing in financially sound projects. Now, the problem, therefore, is the same challenge as any other investor. The problem is that you have to produce projects which are financially sound. If they are financially sound, pension funds will invest in them, and they can invest in them. I don't think it's a question of actually changing the law in that respect. But I wonder whether you think another factor, another important factor behind private sector investment in the green sector in general is also the kind of discipline that the private sector brings to investment. If you like, the sort of independent due diligence, that seems to me to be a benefit that can add a lot to projects. Would you agree with that?
I would absolutely agree. That is the great benefit of private sector investment. So we see this opposition to it because, in a sense, I think there's an unspoken view that greening the economy is kind of socialism under another name, but that's completely wrong. Completely wrong-headed viewpoint, and we really need to look at it in terms of changing the system so that it becomes sustainable, but doing it through mainstream mechanisms. And that means fashioning our instruments for raising capital so that they do comply with the law, that they do comply with the requirements of, say, pension funds to invest in sound projects. I agree with you. They should be investing in sound projects. We should be fashioning the investment vehicles so that investing in the green projects is more sound than investing in the highly uncertain and highly dangerous projects that are associated with fossil fuels. Okay,
so I think we've heard quite a lot from the speakers. So I wonder if anyone has any questions from the floor. Gentleman over there. Have we got some microphones? Some with microphones.
Thank you. Is that on?
I think we can, yeah. Everyone here? Yeah.
Can everyone hear?
Yeah.
Great.
Could you also identify yourselves when you're
Yeah, my name's Tony Burden. I'm the head of the Growth and Resilience Department in the UK Department for International Development. So, you know, our focus is more around low-income countries. But there was a nice synergy there around building capacity on managing and developing these kind of projects, thinking of the Korean Export Bank and the sort of multiple ways you've moved to getting bankable projects developed. And then this description of this mass of finance, which is looking for somewhere to go, but how? And, you know, I reflect on the lower income countries where, you know, we're going to be agreeing a sustainable development goal next year. Zero poverty, achieving zero poverty globally will be one of the big missions of those goals. Now, how do we do that in low-income countries? We need much, much higher and much greener growth. And the scale of investment that's needed is huge to provide the energy, to match the growth of cities, transport, all of this. And public finances are completely insufficient, so it's got to be private finance. It's got to be that big lump on the graph there. But how? How do you get bankable projects in countries where capacity, you know, isn't really good enough, political instability, problems of corruption sometimes, all of those issues, you know, how do we de-risk all of that? So I'd be really interested to hear the panel's views on how we get more bankable projects in more countries and get them financed. Thank you.
Okay, someone?
Yeah. Our initial problem, as I've said earlier, is building up a pipeline consisting of bankable and viable PPP projects. Our answer is setting up a fund similar to project development and monitoring facility. Most of the investors, especially foreign ones, when they go to the Philippines and talk to the center and ask for investment opportunities, the first thing that they would ask is, who prepared the feasibility studies for the project? Compared to previous years wherein we do not have that PDMF yet, they will not be interested to join the bidding of the project because they know it's the implementing agency which prepared the project with questions on the capacity of the implementing agencies. But because of the PDMF, and we were able to procure or hire internationally renowned consultancy firms, these firms lend their credibility to the project, to the feasibility study. So that entices or attracts the private investors, even foreign ones, from joining our bid of these projects. And through the PDMF, since these experts are working with our implementing agencies, and they have also encounters with the private, especially the local private sector, there is some sort of transfer of skills and expertise along the process.
Anybody want to add to that? I mean, I would just comment, having spent a fair amount of time in sub-Saharan African countries, that, you know, things like corruption just destroy the attempt to do anything, more or less. You know, projects are awarded not based on any kind of open, transparent process, not based on, you know, often the realism of the project. They're just based on somebody who knows somebody. And what happens? The projects fail, inevitably. And it's difficult to know how to answer that question. You know, so long as society in various different countries accepts the idea that this is legitimate, or, you know, does nothing about it, what can you do? It's really really difficult, I think, and it's a real handicap, I think, to growth of any kind, green or otherwise. It results in, you know, if you think of the fact that Korea was, you know, at the time, you know, sort of, I don't know, 30, 40 years ago, Korea was poorer than Tanzania. Look at Korea now, you know, and there's no reason why Tanzania shouldn't be like Korea, other than I would submit, you know, one major factor in that is corruption. So, you know, it's difficult to know how to answer that question, I think.
Well, one of the factors involved in the Korean miracle, as opposed to what happened in Tanzania, was that Korea used an objective standard for allocating capital to projects. And that objective standard was export performance. So if you were receiving government funds through the Economic Planning Board, and they were directed towards building an export industry in automobiles, shipbuilding or whatever it might have been, if you weren't achieving the exports, then the funds dried up. And you couldn't fudge that. You know, Korea was determined to build up its expertise and capabilities, and therefore that was a non-negotiable issue. If your exports weren't performing, the funds were discontinued. And that kind of objective standard is one that also needs to apply to these green projects, and that's where bonds come in, because, you know, bonds are not soft instruments. Bonds are hard-edged. The investors want their return. And the return is guaranteed by the contract, and if you don't provide those returns, then you're going to be involved in an investor dispute, and those disputes can get very, very ugly. Just ask Argentina how ugly they can get. And so when people like myself say that the greening of capitalism has to involve the bond markets, that's done for two reasons. Not just that the bond markets have all of these funds under management, which are potentially available, but also because the bond markets are instruments of discipline, and they will discipline investment projects, and they will punish any investment project that strays off course. They promised a green public transport system, and instead they build a highway. The bond markets will punish that, and that would be, I think, good for the greening of the industrial system.
Yeah, and I think also linked to that, another problem that again I've seen in sub-Saharan Africa, I believe Philippines is probably a better place. I'd be interested to hear your comments, is that there is no system for deciding whether to do this project or that project. This project will be done because we can raise the money for this project, not because it's a greater priority than that project. So unless you have some sort of system, you're not doing exactly what Professor Matthews is saying. You're not choosing the priority sectors. You're just choosing the sectors you can get the money for today, which of course is not a long-term policy. I mean, I'd be interested to hear how you decide your priority of projects as far as the Philippines is concerned.
Every start of the administration, all implementing agencies are required to draw up their list of priority projects, which are aligned with the objectives of the President's development agenda. So it's a long list, wish list of projects. And the first thing that the decision makers would ask is which of these projects are most needed and which ones are economically viable. After determining, or what's in it for the government to do these projects, after determining the economic viability of these projects, we impose a hurdle rate of, right now it's 15% economic internal rate of return. After it passes the economic viability test, it will now be determined which is the most viable option to do these projects, whether it's publicly funded, or we do it via PPP, or we do it through official development assistance. In doing PPPs, we have certain criteria. Even if it's very important for the government to do these projects, but we do not have takers from the private sector and lenders, it's useless unless we do an availability-based PPP. So we also take into account the financial and commercial viability of these projects.
Yeah,
we do value for money analysis.
Yeah, so in other words, you have a coherent system, unlike other countries, and that I think is one of the key things. Okay, so any other questions from the floor? Anyone want to?
There's someone at the back.
At the back.
Okay, at the back. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. John Paul Paddock from WWF Korea. I guess I have a question following on the moderator's last question, and also on Professor Matthews' discussion about the greening of finance. And all throughout the day, we've heard about the dangers of 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 a world beyond 2 degrees and the damage that it would do to our planet and to humans. Several, just an example, I'm thinking about this because of University of Macquarie in Australia. Recently, several large global banks have decided not to fund a coal project in Australia, in fact. And this is a project that is transporting coal from the mine to the port through the Great Barrier Reef, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and whose financing is being considered by the Korea Exim Bank, in fact. So I guess more generally for the bankers in the room, the question, and for everybody, in fact, how do we build in more robust green economy filters and criteria in the decision-making process of PPPs, so that we end up not only having scale, but also projects that contribute to the type of green economy and creative economy that we strive for?
Okay. Somebody want to pick that one up?
Yeah, well, we've already raised in the discussion today the issue of the way that investments have been going to fossil fuel interests, fossil fuel projects, and that they represent a problem in terms of subsidies. Huge subsidies are being paid to them, whereas these subsidies might have been justified when people were discovering fossil fuels and the magic of fossil fuels 100 years ago, but they certainly cannot possibly be justified today, and yet they remain in place because the vested interests benefit from them. So we've already raised that issue today. Now you're raising the other associated issue of the investments that continue to flow towards these fossil fuel projects. And you mentioned ones in the Galilee Basin, for example, in Queensland in Australia. These are very, very controversial, of course, in Australia itself, because the country doesn't want to see itself viewed by the rest of the world as perpetually pumping out fossil fuels to China and to India and other countries that are prepared to buy them. And indeed, we can see that there's a mounting sense that investments in fossil fuel-based projects are stranded assets, that they're never going to get their return, that they're full of uncertainty, that they're dangerous kinds of investments. So I think it's long overdue that the focus has been put back on the uncertainties and dangers associated with investing in fossil fuel projects, as opposed to the chorus of criticism of investments that are channeled towards the green sector, that the sun doesn't shine during the night, and so on. There are answers to all of those points, but I welcome your remarks about putting the investments that go into the fossil fuel sector under the microscope.
And I think also that Mr. Jeong has already raised the point that the behaviour of the banking market is changing, and it's partly a reputation risk issue. Is it worth doing this particular project? If it's going to raise a storm of criticism of the bank, the benefit you're getting from one project is overwhelmed by the disbenefit you're getting from a storm of criticism. So part of the reason I think for the Equator Principles is exactly to show that banks are operating according to international sustainable norms. I mean, the Equator Principles, I think, are based on the IFC's own lending principles, precisely to show that banks are coming into line, if you like, with the norm with international organisations. So I think there are significant changes of behaviour taking place there. And so clearly, banks, as much as the bond market, they want to do deals. They want to finance projects. So we come back to the basic point that if you present people with a good project, they'll provide the finance. And the role, if there is one, I think, for the public sector, be it multilateral or bilateral, is to provide some types of support. I think sometimes it's a little facile. We'll just provide first loss support kind of idea, which I don't think is what's needed here. It's targeted support where you've got particular aspects of a risk within a project, which are a problem for the private sector. There may be political risks, as Ms. Yang raised. There may be technological risks, because in the end banks are not in a position to take a view on new relatively untried technology. Again, you come back to the risk thing. It's not their job to take risk on that kind of thing. So somebody else should take that risk for them. That may be the manufacturer. It may be an international organization. These things can be done if the parties work together. Again, I think it comes back to this one simple thing, that all the time, that if you have a good project, you'll find the money. And it can be, if you have a good green project, you'll find the money. It doesn't make any difference whether, what kind of project it is. The finance will usually be available if the project is done right. I think we are seeing serious change of behaviour as far as the private sector, particularly the banking sector, are concerned here. Okay, do we have another question from the gentleman over there?
Hi, my name is Michael Hunkeler. I'm a student at SNU, and I'm interested about the activities of KEXIM. I believe around more than 10 years ago, there was an issue that a lot of nations viewed exporting facilitation by financial institution as an illegal subsidy, and not in accordance with the WTO. And there was also a ruling, but that was actually not really important, as all the products were not done anymore at that time. And of course, a lot of things have changed now over the last couple of years. Is the sentiment still there that this might be not in accordance with the contract, or is this very well established right now? I'm very much aware that, of course, a lot of countries have exporting facilitating institutions that grant loans and also credit guarantees.
Well, I'm sorry, but actually I'm not kind of familiar with export financing, because I'm from the part of EDCF. But as far as I understand, KEXIM does not provide kind of concessional loan to the Korean enterprises to meet the WTO guidelines. And I said, I mean, we have different official financing instrument within the KEXIM, and EDCF is kind of official development assistance, which is entrusted by the Korean government. So that is the more concessional. I mean, it has more concessionality than the export financing. So we do not say like concessionality for the export financing, but we want to make kind of blended credit to the PPP project, and that is the kind of technical challenge to initiate PPP project in developing countries. Because as you mentioned, we have to meet the WTO guidelines with the export financing, but the ODA can provide more concessional loans. So we are thinking how to make mixed credit or blended finance into the one project without violating the WTO or OECD guidelines. Yeah.
Can I make a comment on that? I'm glad you raised the issue of the WTO, because the WTO, in terms of climate change issues, has been painted in this very negative light that actions taken by governments to build their green industries are in contravention of WTO guidelines, as if that is something very bad. They should be sent to jail, something like that. But the reality is China built its wind power system, which is now a very, very successful industry. Puts China the #1 industry in the world in wind power, both in building turbines and generating power from those turbines. And China did it, frankly, through the imposition of local content requirements, LCRs. And they were imposed from about the year 2004, 2005, up until about 2011. The United States protested at the WTO, the EU protested at the WTO, and China took note of these protests, and then at a certain point they quietly withdrew these local content requirements. Why? Because they'd done their job. and China already had a comprehensive value chain to build wind turbines and operate wind turbines. Now India is doing the same thing in solar photovoltaics, and this time they're imposing local content requirements under the National Solar Program, and the United States is taking them to the WTO, in fact not just once but twice. Now, why are these WTO guidelines imposed, and what is the justification for exemptions from these WTO guidelines? Well, there are exemptions in certain circumstances. There are exemptions for various public issues, such as protecting a particular threatened species or protecting public health. So there are, recognised exemptions. Now, we're talking about changing the climate to make it safe for future generations. We're talking about changing our industrial system to make it less carbon intensive so that it has a future. Now, what could be more of a public interest requirement than that? And yet, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change has never referred its deliberations to the WTO to say, we would support a country having a 5-year exemption from free trade rules for particular products if that country is going to meet requirements that are spelt out by ourselves, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Now, I don't think the WTO would necessarily object to that, because it would make them seem to be supporting the efforts of countries like China and India and then many other countries coming along behind them to actually build these green industries through a temporary suspension of the operation of free trade rules. But that's not something that has been explored as yet under the Kyoto Protocol, but perhaps it could be explored under a post-Kyoto Protocol.
Okay, thank you. I think our time is unfortunately running on, so we probably have to sum up at this stage. So what I'd like to ask each panelist to do is to just maybe suggest one or two takeaways for GGGI here. What are things that GGGI could be doing to move this agenda forward? I wonder if you'd like to start, Professor Matthews, on that one.
Well, I think I've made enough general points without wishing to repeat myself. I'd just like to say to GGGI, how are you going to justify the greening of an economy? How are you going to justify the greening of an energy system in a way that will overcome the objections from vested interests? Because that is clearly the major political issue. And I would draw your attention to an article that a collaborator and myself, Dr. Hao Tan, and I published in Nature earlier this year, where we said we put forward the reason that renewable energy systems have found it so hard to make any headway against the vested fossil fuel interests is that they're always justified, or they're attempted to be justified, on grounds of decarbonisation, on grounds of climate change. And we argued that that is an impossibly difficult burden to impose on renewable energies, when there's a much more immediate justification for renewable energies, and that is in terms of energy security. A country that builds a renewable energy industry through manufacturing industries is building energy security. It doesn't have to import fossil fuels. It's not subject to hostage from oil producers in the Middle East like Saudi Arabia. It can generate its own energy through its own manufacturing systems, and we argued that that is precisely what motivates China. And so my recommendation to the GGGI would be, think about renewable energies and their justification in terms of energy security and not just in terms of decarbonisation.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Yang, would you like to make a comment?
Well, so we are talking about public-private cooperation, and I think they both have two different, they're opposite interests. For private investment and green growth, I'm not sure if they have the same goal in the project. So I think the GGGI should at first focus on what is the same or common goal between the private investment and green growth, which is small, like opposite to the, the more focusing on the environmental benefit and social benefit. So I want to recommend the GGGI to develop kind of mechanism to evaluate or to reconsider the social benefits and environment of the PPP project to the host government, so the host government can expand its policies in green growth and sustainable growth, economic growth.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Austria?
Okay, global institutions like GGGI can continue to advocate among the member countries and even to non-member countries of GGGI regarding the adoption of policy that will encourage green infrastructure and technologies, especially in the field of PPPs where private sector efficiency and innovation can be tapped other than financing. GGGI can also play an important role in increasing and promoting awareness on sustainable green growth strategies and best practices that both emerging and developing countries may integrate into their national development plans and goals. It can also assist governments in identifying appropriate policies that need to be crafted to facilitate private sector investments on green infrastructure. These policies can be investment frameworks which can address and identify the financial and economic viability of green infrastructures. In addition, GGGI can also aid governments to study possible barriers and constraints that private sector investments are currently facing in view of the government's interest in shifting towards green infrastructures. Globally, GGGI can promote technological cooperation not only among governments, but also among the private sector organizations which have interest in investing in green infrastructure, especially in developing and least developed countries. And Philippines, as one of the most highly vulnerable countries to the adverse impacts of climate change, we are open to exploring opportunities in strengthening our partnerships with GGGI and to ensure that the right strategies and policy reforms are put in place towards a more balanced growth that considers both environmental and social sustainability.
Okay, thank you. Mr. John?
Well, I'd like to share share all the comments and views with panelists. Well, actually, I'm the only one representing commercial interests. As mentioned, globally, banking business environment is becoming tougher and tougher than before. After experiencing several crises, so these days, where BNP Paribas, as typical commercial bank, we are still chasing some profit-oriented business, and in that context, whenever we have new transaction, we consider financing. Then we have to take into account lots of elements in terms of profitability versus risk. Particularly these days, we are more concerned about reputation risk. So in that context, we are now much more very, very selective in supporting transactions. And in order to diversify support, it is more often for us to work together with MDB and ECAs like Exim Bank. And as said, the regulatory and the legal environment is also changing. So it is very, very necessary for all the counterparties and all the players should know this change and trend and direction. So in that context, I think when GGGIF would take some significant role to help competent authority and host countries establish right policy and measures.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, well, I think time has been much too short for a discussion of this subject. Would have been nice if we could have also had a few more time for more questions from the floor. perhaps I can sum up by saying I think it's evident, not least from the figures that Professor Matthews showed us, that there's a need for creative and innovative collaboration to scale up private sector capital involvement in green investment. Some suggestions have been made here as to how GGGI can be involved in that, and no doubt GGGI will be taking those away. So I think it remains for me to thank you for your participation, and I hope you'll join me in thanking the panel for their very useful contributions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, moderator and speakers, for sharing your great insights and also keeping to time. And now we will go to the grand ballroom for the closing plenary. And please keep in mind that your personal belongings you left in the ballroom will be kept in the backside. And also please fill out the survey and then submit